Thank you. Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the council. As the mayor introduced, the consideration on before you at this evening is a proposed amendment to the city zoning code as it relates to size restrictions that apply to accessory structures within the city's residential zoning districts. There were a couple items that really brought this topic up for discussion before the commission. There was a recent proposed accessory structure located within the area city impact, and as we went through the review process on that project, it did identify that there were some inconsistencies within a couple different areas of the zoning code as it related to accessory structures. So we did want to look at clarifying and correcting that item. And then the second item was that over the course of the last 5 years, we have received various requests for variances with respect to the size of accessory structures that may be permitted in residential districts. 3 of those variance requests were received in the last 5 years. All 3 were granted, and these were for accessory structures that were in excess of the current 1,000 square foot size limit. They ranged in size from just under 1,300 square feet to just over 1,400 square feet. And all 3 of those were approved by the Board of Adjustment, and the board had made several comments that the city should consider allowing some greater flexibility in the size allowance for these types of accessory structures. So we began the review really looking at that inconsistency between the language in a couple different districts, but also took into consideration the variances that we'd received with respect to these structures over the course of the last several years. I was going to give a little background on the current standards. Currently, under the zoning code, we do define accessory structures being any structure attached to or located adjacent to a home or on the same lot, including awnings, steps, porches, carports, garages, and storage buildings. An accessory structure shall be considered detached if located more than 2 feet from the principal or primary structure. It's important to note that it does include both attached and detached accessory structures. As we looked at what is allowable in the various zoning districts, for the most part, within the FR, which is the Farm, Ranch, and Outdoor Recreation District, we do allow agricultural ranching and outdoor recreation structures with no size limit, but private garages are limited to those that are designed to accommodate no more than 4 vehicles. The significance of that is that that was the city's prior language that was amended back in 1991. The old standard was, and this applied in all of our residential zoning districts, was the language that was designed to accommodate no more than 4 vehicles. At that time, the code was changed to a more uniform standard of the current 1,000 square feet, but it appears this was one zoning district that didn't get updated along with that effort. Within the suburban residential, the R1, R2, and R3 districts, private garages and workshops are not to exceed 1,000 square feet, so that is currently the size limit within those districts. And then as you move into the R4 and the RO districts, there is some slightly different language within those 2 districts, and it's kind of interesting to note that those are probably our 2 most intense residential zoning districts within the community. The language within those 2 districts reads private garages and workshops. Such garages or parking structures shall not exceed 2 stories or a maximum of 20 feet above mean finished grade. Private garages accessory to single-family dwellings shall not exceed 1,000 square feet in size. And what's somewhat unique is the R4 and the RO districts specifically have this size limit of no more than 20 feet in height for this detached accessory structures, where we do not have a similar size or height limitation within the R1, R2, or the R3 district. So, for example, you could have a private garage or workshop structure if it was not within the required rear yard area within the R3 district, 35 feet in height. And as you move into the R4 district with more intense residential uses, we came down to this 20-foot height limitation. And in our research, it was unclear as to what was really the reason that these 2 districts were treated differently than any of our other less intense residential zoning districts. And so that is one of the items that is proposed to be changed this evening. The second item that is unique in the R4 and the RO district is the language reads private garages accessory to a single-family dwellings, where in all of the zoning districts it reads private garages and workshops. And that workshop was one of the elements that was absent in consideration of that one incident in the ACI. And so we do want to make all the language consistent among all the different zoning districts. And then as you look at our definition of what we consider to be a private garage, it's an enclosed space for the storage of 1 or more private vehicles for residents of the premises. So those are kind of a summary of the elements of the zoning code that currently address these types of structures. So as I mentioned, there were a few items that we found that were potentially deficient in the code as it exists today. The first of which is it's not explicitly clear that the size limitations apply to both attached and detached workshops and garages. It is clear if you go into reading the definitions, but it's not explicitly clear in the individual zoning districts themselves.
Say that again.
It's clear if you look into the actual definition of what an accessory structure is, but if you look at the language as it appears within each of the zoning districts, it appears that it's as if that it would only apply to a detached structure. But if you actually look at the definition, you see that it applies to both detached and attached structures. So we wanted to make that explicitly clear just to avoid any potential confusion. As you look at the SR district, it has the older language of designed to accommodate no more than 4 vehicles. And so we felt that we should standardize that with what language we have in the other zoning districts currently. The R4 and the RO districts have no size limitations when such structures are not accessory to a single-family dwelling. So when you have a private garage or workshop that is accessory to a single-family dwelling in that district, it has a maximum size limit of 1,000 square feet currently. But if it was accessory to a 2-family dwelling, a 3-family dwelling, or a multifamily dwelling, there is no size limit that applies. And so that is an area that we think ought to be addressed. The second is that the R4 and the RO district have a more restrictive height limitation than the other zoning districts. So as you look in the R1, R2, and R3, so long as you're not within the required rear yard setback, such a structure can be up to the maximum building height that's allowed in that district. But within the R4 and the RO, regardless of where it's placed on the property, is limited to that 20 feet in height.
Looks like Walter has a question. Please.
Bill, I may have misheard your second bullet up there. I thought you said the FR was the one that had the older language.
I'm sorry.
Not more than 4
Correct.
vehicles.
That's Farm Ranch. I apologize. That's a typo.
So I'm right?
You were right.
Wow.
You were
I
correct.
thought you would, I was going to have you,
There you go.
Don't get
correct my hearing.
So we have the R4 and the RO district that have a more restrictive height limit than less intense zoning districts. Additionally, the R4 and the RO districts excluded the term workshop within the size limitation language, so it's a bit of an inconsistency within the different districts as well. And then, as I mentioned, finally, there have been multiple variances that have been granted for slightly larger accessory structures, indicating a possible need to provide a greater allowance for those types of uses in certain situations. And, we really don't want to put individuals into the position of having to obtain a variance. Variances are usually a resort, essentially a action of last resort. It's usually a request where you're being denied a use that others commonly enjoy, that essentially the zoning code or restrictions are denying you some use and some economic use of the property. And so that's a very high burden of proof when you go before the Board of Adjustment. In many of these instances, in the cases where people were seeking slightly larger accessory structures, they were reasonable given the considerations of the property size, its proximity or visibility from adjacent properties. And we really don't want individuals to have to go through that variance process. It's really not the best channel to address those situations. So the proposal that's before you this evening, the draft ordinance, within the SR, R1, and R3 district, we would clarify that the size limits, and this actually applies in all districts, that we'd clarify that the size limits do apply to attached and detached accessory structures, so it's clear to anyone who's reading the code. We would retain the current limit of 1,000 square feet as a permitted accessory use, and then we would insert a conditional use allowance for an accessory structure up to 1,500 square feet in size. That provides an opportunity for an individual who wishes to have a larger structure to apply, have a conditional use permit, and to have an opportunity to have a hearing for the Board of Adjustment. But the burden and the situation is much different when you're looking at a conditional use permit than you are a variance. Conditional uses are generally presumed to be permitted, but there may be restrictions or conditions that need to be placed based upon the situation or the circumstances that exist. And the standards for approval of a CUP are very different than the R4A variance. Within the R3, R4, and the RO district, we would again clarify that the size limits apply to both attached and detached. We would insert the term workshop. This is for specifically the R4 and the RO district. After the private garage language, the standardized language within the code, we would retain the 1,000 square feet as a permitted accessory use where accessory to a single-family dwelling, and then insert a new limit of 600 square feet per dwelling unit for any other residential uses. So if it's a 2-family dwelling or a 3-family dwelling or multifamily, there would be an allowance of 600 square feet of essentially garage space for each dwelling unit. And that can easily accommodate a 3-car garage if that was desired for each of those dwelling units. But it allows for the accessory structure to be scaled proportionally with the residential use on the property. And so if you had a fourplex, there could be 2,400 square feet essentially of garage or workshop or storage accessory structure space on the property. So it helps keep that accessory use in proportion to the residential use on the property. Again, we would insert a conditional use permit for allowance of accessory structures of up to a maximum of 1,500 square feet, as in the R1 and the R2 district. And then we would remove the specific building height limitations from the R4 and the RO district and have them operate like all of the rest of the residential zoning districts with respect to accessory structures. I didn't note in here, but in the FR district, we would also replace the design to occupy by more than 4 vehicles to be 1,000 square feet to be consistent. And then within the definitions, and this is how we have historically interpreted this section of the code, is the 1,000 square feet has generally been the footprint of the accessory structure. If there's any loft storage, mezzanine type storage up on a second floor, that has not been considered as part of the square footage, so it's really been applied to the building footprint. And so there is a proposed insertion into the definition of the accessory structures to clarify that that is only to be applied to the building footprint or the land area that the building occupies. The Planning and Zoning Commission conducted a public hearing on this on September 25th and recommended approval of the proposed ordinance to the City Council. The actions before the council this evening is to conduct the public hearing and, upon consideration of any testimony presented, to approve the ordinance under suspension of the rules, and be read by title and published by summary. Consider the ordinance on first reading, reject the ordinance, or take such other action as the council may deem appropriate. With that, I would be happy to try to answer any questions that the council may have at this time.
Thank you, Bill.